back in the saddle.
As Dr. Robeson in the intro video says, everybody does need home brew. So we're
in
back.
Moderation. Everything in moderation.
Like our drinking habits.
Well, you're going to be upset with me when it comes to what's in your cup today, but
I understand.
Oh well. What's new? I'm used to people being upset with me. I'm something of a disappointment. So here we are. First recording back in Louisiana.
That's true. He's Louisiana Joe now. Tennessee Joe is gone.
No, he's still very much alive. He lives within me. Every time I see like an Alabama hat or an LSU T-shirt or whatever, it just go Vols.
Go Vols.
Comes out.
Good old Rocky Top.
Yeah, we don't woo when we Rocky Top.
Yeah, well,
not in this house.
Not that kind of white.
So today we're going to talk about something a little bit different.
Very different for us.
And since neither of us have any knowledge of mining efforts and illegal mining efforts in Peru, we figured we would get a guest on to talk about this. And it's kind of it's an interesting topic. I did a little bit of, you'll be proud.
A little bit of digging.
A little bit of reading, a little bit of digging, a little research here and there.
Were you mining information?
I did mine some information. This is good. I hate that was funny, but here we are. So we've got on the show your colleague and my old thesis committee member, Dr. Mark Dries from Southeastern. Good old local connections. We'll bring on Dr. Dries. There he is. Look at that.
How's it going, guys? Thanks for having me.
It's always kind of funny when you bring on a guest and we've been talking for like 5 minutes before, and they're like, "Hey, how's it going?" It's like, I already told you. Like, we already did this. The formality part is done. It's like waving goodbye on a Zoom. I think we'll always still do it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And this has been it's been a long time coming. I feel like I've been trying to hound Mark for the past, I don't know, year or so.
I'm squirrely. I'm hard to nail down. So I appreciate your persistence, and I appreciate you and your listeners, taking a little field trip with me a little further south than they might be used to. But hopefully it's at least of some interest to folks of the historical bent.
So, I mean, let's just broad strokes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you a super generic question because that's what a good historian wants, right? They want a softball. What do we need to know about Mercury mining in Peru, and what's its tie? Because you're on homebrew history, so it can't just be current events. It's got to be the historical.
Sure.
So by all means.
Yeah, well, I mean, the mining that I focus on, it doesn't get much more historical than that, at least in the part of the world I focus on. So, again, I appreciate the softball and thinking in really broad strokes. I'm a historian of colonial Latin America, specifically Peru. So, if you're not familiar with that area, what is important to know? One of the most important things to understand is that the discovery of the New World and Spanish colonization really opened up a world of mineral resources to broaden global trade. If you think about, the creation of a global system of trade, a lot of that was things coming from the Far East, silks, porcelain, spices that were going in the direction of Europe once Europeans, Portuguese and Spanish and others pioneered routes to get access to those kinds of goods, right? And the only way to balance that trade was with mineral resources that usually originated in the Spanish possessions of the New World, specifically silver. So what my specific focus is I look at how Spaniards extracted mercury from a site high in the Andes Mountains in Peru, because mercury ends up being a key piece in the production chain for the manufacturing of silver. And that silver goes back to Spain and then goes out throughout Europe. And then eventually most of it ends up in Ming China, if we're thinking about the 16th century. So I look at a very unique mining context because mercury is everywhere and it's nowhere. There are very few places where it exists in concentrations high enough to be mined, and its ore is called cinnabar. There's not that many places where this is readily available. And it's unique in that sense, but it's also unique in the sense that they needed labor. And they took advantage of the indigenous population and forced them into a labor regime that was uniquely deadly. And people knew this from its earliest days, that working in these mines was, one Spanish 16th century source calls it a virtual slaughterhouse. A place where people just went to die because of the brutal conditions and, of course, exposure to mercury itself. So what I think is interesting to understand about this is how this one unique context and the exploitation of indigenous people ends up playing a key role in the production of huge amounts of silver that really facilitated the growth of global trade.
So, Mark, I'm curious, of all the things, in historiography, how does one end up getting interested in this kind of topic? What's that spark for you?
That's a great question. So honestly, for me, it's the kind of stuff that I feel like we all might have in common, right? An interest in kind of tangible things. The first thing that made me interested in mining was, just kind of the material culture of it. How do you go from finding a rock on a mountain to having a silver coin, right? What's the chemistry there? What's the geology there that sets those kinds of things up? And then the physical environment of the Andes was fascinating to me as a kid who grew up in the Midwest. I mean, I wasn't used to mountains. And then you're talking about the Andes, you're talking about mining sites that are 14, 15,000 feet up. So I was fascinated about what that would feel like to work and to live in an atmosphere like that was so different from anything I'd seen or been used to. So that kind of material culture stuff sort of pulled me in. And then I just started looking at the kinds of social relations that existed there in this seemingly out of the way but extremely important place if we think about the Spanish Empire.
And this too is at a period when the Spanish are growing by leaps and bounds and are essentially conquering much of what we today think of as the Americas, and they're crossing over the ocean, and they have this massive armada and these fleets. So the idea of mining for silver is more for anything else than expand their wealth and continue their kind of colonial power. But what are the conditions like for the people that are living in the Andes Mountains doing this mining, and how do we go from the Spanish setting sail? When do they discover the silver? How do they begin the mining operation?
That's a great question. And this is one of the things that I kind of focus on in my work because I try and connect those dots. How does it go from being a geological resource to being something that the Spaniards can use as a trade good or as a key piece of their economy? And the bottom line is that the Spaniards didn't invent a whole lot. When they arrived, indigenous people were already extracting silver. They were involved in various forms of metallurgy, smelting, and others. They had technologies that were unique to the Andean environment, but were very adequate for doing the kinds of metallurgy that they were interested in. So the Spanish just kind of followed the indigenous people, asked them where they were getting things, and then when they found out, they would oftentimes use force to make native people do that work for them. And as far as the extractive process went, I mean, native people could recognize which rocks had silver, and the Spaniards would just tell them, you need to bring me this amount. And early on, really up until the mid 1550s, 1560s, at a lot of the key sites, it was picking it up off the ground. The single greatest silver mine in the history of humankind was the mine in Potosi in modern day Bolivia. And for the first 50 or 60 years of a huge mining boom, people were literally picking up rocks off the ground, smelting them using Andean technology, and then just turning in the silver to the Spaniards as a way of paying their tribute taxes.
That's insane, to think about. One of the things that kind of piques my curiosity is obviously the Spanish have a huge cultural influence in Peru. Is that still prevalent today?
Absolutely, absolutely, in interesting ways. Yeah, in interesting ways. So if you think about Peru on a very basic level, Spanish is spoken almost everywhere, but you'll also have Quechua, or as a Quechua speaker would call it, Runasimi, the tongue of the people, that's spoken widely in the mountainous regions, especially in the central and southern parts of Peru. You also have Aymara spoken around the region of Lake Titicaca, and those are obviously languages that predated Spanish arrival. But if you go to almost any town, from relatively small out of the way towns to massive cities like Lima, you're going to see in the historic center, you're going to see that basic urban scale. You have your plaza where you have, your most important church, where you have your seat of government, and then you have your traza, your grid pattern of streets radiating outward from there. And it's usually very easy to tell what buildings were built in the colonial period. The architecture is very similar. You have kind of two-story houses with balconies. You have a multitude of churches for all kinds of Catholic religious orders that all played an important role in the economy, in the social functioning, in the governing of Peru. So, there's definitely very much an imprint of that colonial period that has persisted very physically all the way up to the present day. Now, one of the fascinating things about the Andes in general is that it was one of the regions that was most densely populated by indigenous people, and one of the regions where that population persisted more than in, say, low-lying regions, oftentimes because for some reason the mountainous areas and the patterns of living in the Andes afforded people some protection from the kinds of diseases that arrived with Europeans. So you have this imprint of Spanish colonialism that marks itself on the physical geography of Peru, but you also have settlement patterns that predated the arrival of Europeans that are also very persistent. You'll see people, living far out on mountains, growing potatoes or quinoa or raising llamas or other things in ways that are probably more reminiscent of indigenous settlement patterns. So it's a really interesting and unique blend that still, isn't always harmonious if we think about modern Peru, for sure.
All right, let's do some compare and contrast here. This is always fun. So, Bo, we have to talk about this soon because I've been doing a lot of reading lately. I've been reading The Earth is Weeping by Peter Cousins, which is just phenomenal about the expansion of the American West. So let's do some compare and contrast. 1873, the United States going through massive panic. George Custer and the 7th Cavalry arrive on the Black Hills and they find gold. Okay, now if you're listening to the audio version of this, heavy quotes around find gold. They see like flecks in water and like, oh yeah, well, we found gold. And then all of a sudden people start flocking to the Black Hills. They're going trampling over Lakota Sioux territory, land ceded to the unceded territories that are given to the Lakota. And all of a sudden we've got this rush of people coming in, trying to mine for gold and exploiting the people that already live there and destroying much of their habitat. And how much of that is maybe comparable to when the Spanish arrive in Peru?
I mean,
I gave you a
very much so.
Yeah. Okay.
Very, very much so, to be honest with you. I mean, especially that idea of that flood of people, the environmental destruction. I mean, very, very, very comparable just in those broad outlines, right? If we think about, again, that silver mine that I mentioned, Potosi, and my work is on a town called Huancavelica, but one of the earliest viceroys of Peru, the leading Spanish authority, described Huancavelica, the Mercury mining center, and Potosi, the great silver mine, as the two, I think he described them as the axis around which these kingdoms of Peru turn. Right. So these two were almost always spoken of in the same breath by colonial officials. But Potosi was the one that had that massive inflow of people. We're thinking about a city in the 1560s that had 150,000 people. It was the largest city in the New World. It was probably larger than any Spanish city. It was probably larger than Paris. It was probably comparable to Constantinople around that time. We're talking about just a truly massive city in a place where there shouldn't even be human populations. It's 14,000 feet up. It is incredibly arid. It's really, really cold as soon as the sun goes down, and then the sun will burn you as soon as it comes up. So it's a strange place to have a city that large and to have the kind of wealth that was literally just coming out of the ground. So it really had a huge environmental impact. They used water to do the refining process. They had stamp mills that crushed the ore that they would then mix with mercury, and that's where the mercury comes in to extract that silver. And so they reshaped all the hydrology of a massive region, and it led to a lot of, as you can imagine, using mercury led to a lot of pollution. That is still very much a legacy in Huancavelica as it is in Potosi today. So I think there's some broad parallels there. And as is often the case, this was land that belonged to indigenous people that was forcibly taken from them. Their labor was exploited in as many ways as it could be by the Spanish, who were very adept and very ingenious at devising legal structures that would allow them to do that. So I think there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, a lot like treaties and peace meetings. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They could probably be email chains at this point.
George Custer to Potosi.
Memos.
Now that is a Wikipedia. That's a good video. Like we could do a short form. Like how quick can I go from Potosi mercury mining to George Custer and the 7th Cavalry?
Mm-hmm. Pretty quickly, as it turns out.
I'm just saying. Apparently, very fast.
Mm-hmm. So, Mark, what's it like? Because especially a lot of our listeners, right? We have a lot of listeners not only in the States but also across the Atlantic on the continent of Europe, and a lot of our listeners don't have a lot of experience with South America, especially with like archival research. So, what's it like going to South America and doing the job of the historian?
Wow. It's that's one of the awesome things about doing the job of a historian is that there's always those interesting archive stories. And the joke that a friend of mine made one time is that historians tell the most interesting stories, but they never put them in the book. or just those stories that come out in conversations like this. My specific archive stories, I think, are kind of interesting and maybe not representative of anyone else's experience, but they do shed a little light on that. So Huancavelica is one of the most impoverished parts of Peru. It's relatively isolated. It's very high up in the mountains. So, when I started trying to do the research, I did preliminary visits, and there were these documents from the 1500s that were, piled up in cardboard boxes in the equivalent of a shed. But because they were at altitude, because they were kept dry, they were in remarkably good shape. So I got permission to work with them. I came back for a longer stay, and I, hopped an overnight bus ride up there, and I get up in the 40-degree weather, and I go over to the archive, and all the boxes are gone. And I said, well, where are they, and can I use them? They're like, well, we moved them off site because we're putting in a floor. And then I realized, well, yeah, I mean, it was a dirt floor, so I can see why they need to do some material improvements. That makes sense. And I said, well, I'll come back in a few weeks. They're like, oh, we'll be done by then. That'll be no problem. Came back in a couple of weeks, and the boxes weren't there. And I said, well, am I going to be able to work with the architect? They're like, well, yeah, but we needed to put in a roof. And then I looked up and I was like, yeah, it doesn't look like that would hold water out very well. So I was kind of amazed they'd survived that long. So there were a series of kind of complications with getting access to the documents. And then once I did, it was incredible. When you're a graduate student, you're interested in some of these questions about a specific historical place, and you dream of just finding those sources that'll let you answer those questions. And for me, at least, I was a little naive methodologically, because I figured if I could just get the sources, everything will become clear to me. Once I got the sources, I realized I was going to have to deal with them the right way to actually create some sort of a coherent view of what was happening in the 1500s in this town. So that part took a lot of work. And it was a very interesting process. Through conversations with people in the archive, with other historians that I met in Lima and other places, I started to kind of piece together sort of the way life was at that time. And that really helped me kind of interact with the documents in a way that let me, I think, give an idea of what was going on in this town in this kind of pivotal period.
I think right now, just because we're 17 minutes in, let's take a little break, and we'll come right back with some more from Dr. Dries and a little bit more about mining and operations in Peru. And Bo, let's go ahead right now. And for the people that are going to watch this on YouTube, let's switch that logo over to Civil War Trails to remind people that, in fact, this podcast, yeah, it's brought to you by Civil War Trails. Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum where you can follow the footsteps of the Army in Northern Virginia all the way to Appomattox to surrender to old Ulysses S. Grant, or you can make your way in through Tennessee, everywhere from Franklin, where, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I edited a lot of those signs. I wrote a couple of them. I've seen them a time or two. You can go down, have the best fried chicken in the world, the Piggly Wiggly in Columbia. Hop in, grab your chicken box, go outside and read about Confederate artillery battery positions during the battles around Columbia. Then make your way out towards Murfreesboro, learn a little bit about the contraband camps and the refugee camps that get established there in 1863, 64. There's so much to learn with Civil War Trails, and there's so many different resources that you can access just by going to their website, and you can find that link right below in the description of this episode, like you can with every episode of Homebrew History, because we do love our friends at Civil War Trails. How about that? That's easy. It's
almost like we've done this before.
I'm pretty good at this. What can I say? Might not do well with most things, but
the one question, right?
Are we back? Because I didn't think we announced that we were back yet.
Well, I guess I don't know. I kind of just jumped in first. Not the first time. It won't be the last time. I'm pretty sure that I have the hardest head this side of the Mississippi River.
I will agree with that.
Yeah, that's fair. Mark, so really the one question is, and of course every historian tries to answer this question, right? Why should people care? Why is this stuff so important?
Yeah, right. I mean, there you go. That's the big one. So really, I mean, broad strokes. When I first started looking at mercury mining in the Andes, one of the advisors, one of the professors I was working with, who later wrote a very really good book on indigenous slavery throughout the Spanish Empire and into the United States. He goes to me, he's like, "Wow, you just really like the most depressing stuff." And I was like, "Man, maybe I need to do some soul searching." But when I thought more about it, why am I digging into this? I just found it to be a really, really interesting story. right? I mean, the lives of people in this place just struck me as fascinating, because if you think about, a mercury mining town, you're thinking about pollution. When you think about Spanish colonialism and forced labor, you're thinking about native people as victims suffering through horrendous circumstances, perhaps worse there than almost anywhere else in the New World. So when I think about it that way, and in those broad strokes, it's a very one-dimensional story. Well, what were those native people doing? We know from brilliant historians who worked in other places that native people they weren't just passive victims. They found ways to manipulate the Spanish legal system, or to manipulate the way that they became legible through their different identities in the Spanish system, in order to mitigate and navigate some of the complications of colonialism. So I said, well, how would they do that where a lot of this exploitation was, for some reasons, kind of the worst? And what I found is that, native people were first of all not monolithic. Different groups who were local to the mines found different ways of navigating the Spanish system. Some of them kind of very skillfully manipulated the way the Spanish identified them. Some of them said, well, we're not native people, we're miners. Because when the Spanish first arrived, as I said, they were following native people. And so these were crucial partners in getting any kind of mercury extraction off the ground. They had expertise, they had knowledge of the ground, where things were and how to extract it. And so they were crucial partners. And so they petitioned the crown. They said, we were here with your first Spanish miners. We were their partners, and we should be exempt from, labor exploitation and taxes. And they won. And subsequent generations said, well, we're indigenous people, and as such, we're subjects of the crown. We have certain rights and privileges, and we have privileges that date back to that period where we were here and were loyal subjects as you established mercury mining. So they kind of subtly shifted how they presented themselves and made themselves legible to this imperial regime in ways that kind of got them out of a lot of the worst kinds of exploitation. Now, other native people were less fortunate. And so the reality was that people were absolutely dying of mercury poisoning, of silicosis, of overwork, and of starvation in these kinds of places. But that isn't the whole story, and isn't the only story. So I was fortunate to find that archive that really hadn't been used by almost any historians, to have a little bit of time and some resources and the support of the local staff to get into it and try and find some of those other stories to complicate what was kind of a one-sided view of what happened there.
This is kind of like, it's a difficult thing to accept, acknowledge, whatever, but the Spanish don't really care, do they? Right? I mean, nobody does, right? If you have the ability to enslave your own workforce, you work them to death, and then you just bring in other people to do the same thing. And if they die, well, they die. And that's like, it's the hardest thing to understand about how, the darkest little slivers and chapters of our history, how they work, is that at the end of the day, they're doing the work, and that's all that they really want out of them is the work. It's not about quality of life. It's not about, who cares? They don't need a house. They don't need this. They don't need that. It's the destruction, really, of a people and of their home for the sake of kind of an imperial endeavor.
Well, I would say that's kind of what happens in some places, but we're historians, right? There's just never a clear, simple answer.
Can never just be, that's it, exactly.
So, I mean, the first thing I would say to complicate that a little bit, if I may, is that not even the Spanish were monolithic in terms of the way that they thought about these kinds of things. As soon as there were ways of exploiting indigenous labor, there were other people pushing back on it, and so technically, indigenous people couldn't be enslaved in the same way people of African descent could, because they were not exposed to Christianity and hadn't rejected it. So people like Bartolome de las Casas said, no, we shouldn't be enslaving these people. And he wrote about the destruction of the Indies dating back to the earliest encounters in the Caribbean. And he said, we're doing a horrible thing. And so the Spanish monarchy very much wanted to avoid out and out slavery. But the reality was that the Spanish Empire was absolutely dependent on the production of native labor, right? So what they tried to do, and the key figure here was a guy named Francisco de Toledo, who was the fifth viceroy of Peru in the 1570s. He tried to create a structure that would allow indigenous communities to continue to exist and to be self-sustaining, but also siphon off their surplus labor and their surplus production in kind. So he created a rotational labor draft, for example, for Huancavelica, where 1 out of every seven men between the ages of 18 and 50 would be required to come and work for a period of time in Huancavelica every year. And there was a geographic area that was subject to this. It was called the Mita, building on the Inca precedent of the Mita, which was a rotational labor system that the Inca pioneered, right? Drawing on the idea that's very Andean of reciprocal labor, right? You work to be a part of a group and you receive certain privileges and protections from that group. Now, the Spanish didn't believe in the part where they gave back, but they certainly built in that idea of reciprocity. You're our subjects, and so we're entitled to extract your labor through these kinds of systems. So the Spanish created this system, but they were also very much dependent on there being an indigenous population, being enough of a population for them to exploit and to siphon that surplus off of. So there were always Spanish colonial officials who were worried about what happens if they all die. What happens if our system is so brutal it kills them off? And these debates, are almost cyclical. They come back all the time. At one point, they think about bringing mercury from China or through the Philippines. At one point, they think about just using mercury coming from Spain to refine silver in South American mines, because mercury was coming from Spain and going to Mexico, and that's how they refined silver there. But ultimately, the system that Toledo put in place in the 1570s, that rotational labor draft I described, it stays in operation all the way up to 1825 and independence in Peru.
I'm curious, Mark. Does Peru still Peru a world producer of mercury and silver?
Mercury, no. Silver, yes. Mining is still absolutely huge business in Peru. Copper is probably one of their biggest exports. Gold is another big one. A lot of this is in the southern Andes, so we're thinking closer to the border with Chile, in massive industrial mining complexes. But there are always, attempts to get new ones up and running, in large older ones. Some of the historical, mines are still producing, but new ones are also being discovered all the time. So Peru is very much a country that relies on the extractive industries.
One of the things that, and Mark, he goes on, study abroad trips through our university, which it's like I really kind of want to tag along, because it's like I have no experience in South America, and it's like if I trust one person in this side of Mississippi, it's Mark Dries to get me through South America safe, sound, and hopefully with all 10 fingers and 10 toes, preferably. But when they obviously are promoting these sorts of trips, I've let Dr. Dries come into my classes from time to time to, give his spiel, so to speak. But I think out of all the folks who lead these study abroad tours, I think Dr. Dries takes the cup for his ability to self promote, because he talks about potatoes, which love potatoes. Okay, I'm white. All right.
Hey.
Any and all kinds of potatoes. But more importantly, he talks about coca leaves. I know that this doesn't really have a whole lot to do with Peruvian mercury mining, but I think this is an interesting point because I was unaware of this. So, Mark, can you kind of tell us a little bit about the coca leaves, how natives use it, and how it's sort of been bastardized by European science?
Absolutely. But your question's better than you even know. According to colonial officials all the way up through modern day, you absolutely cannot have mining in the Andes without coca leaves. Coca leaves are a product that's native to the Andes Mountains, and it was a part of Andean, indigenous societies going back 1,000 years before Europeans ever arrived. So it was something that was a part of their daily lives, but also very important from a ritual perspective. And what traditionally was done is you would take the leaves and you would kind of hold them in your cheek, right? And so in Spanish, they would call this chewing coca, would be the way you translate it, but you don't really chew it. You just kind of hold it there. And if you hold it there for a while, the alkaloids that are in the leaves can give you kind of a similar physiological response to the one that your body would have with caffeine. Your heart rate picks up a little bit, you have a little more energy, you're a little less hungry, a little less thirsty. So it's fantastic if you're hiking, up and down mountains from, 2,000 feet above sea level to 14,000 feet above sea level. It's great if you're going down rawhide ladders into mines to carry out ore on your back. So it was absolutely crucial to that process from just a physical perspective, but also from a ritual perspective. Andean people still, the Andean cosmology is one where reciprocal relationships kind of define the relationship between, individuals and the natural world, right? Our kind of Western separation of the spiritual and the physical doesn't really exist in the Andean cosmology. So if you're taking ore out, you need to give something back. And if we think about Huancavelica specifically, there's in many of these mines, there's kind of a figure that's seen as the owner of the mines, right? This is called the Muki in Huancavelica, but in other mines like Potosí, it was called El Tío, which means the uncle, but it's kind of a representation of the earth spirit. And so you have to make offerings to this in order to go in and out safely, and hopefully that'll allow for there to be your work to be productive, right? So coca leaves go a long way back, and they're still extremely important in the Andes today. If you were to get off an airplane in La Paz, in Bolivia, where I think El Alto is one of the highest airports in the world. It's at least 12,000 feet. You might immediately get a headache trying to pick up your backpack. So one of the best remedies for that is coca leaves, which will help you kind of deal with the altitude sickness and the acclimatizing process. But as we all know, going back to, I believe it was the 1860s, German chemists were able to isolate that alkaloid and turn it into cocaine, which has a variety of potential medical uses and some other more hazardous recreational uses. But the history of coca and cocaine are very much interconnected in really fascinating ways. For a while, Peru thought it was going to become, the world's producer of a wonder drug. And then there started to be concerns that overlapped with racial tensions and understandings of race in different societies, that cocaine was being used by populations, particularly of color. There was a famous case of a Peruvian sailor who was using it when they arrived in the New World, or when they arrived in New York, I believe, and it led to one of the first arrests and prosecutions of someone for using cocaine. So cocaine has had a few lives of its own as well, but it's still something that is an issue in industrialized countries, just like coca leaf chewing is still something that's remarkably common in all these different parts of the Andes.
I'm sorry, I have to do this.
I'm waiting.
The many lives of cocaine.
That's right.
There we go.
That's right.
And I am not the expert on this. There's a lot of reading you could do on this. Again, this is best learned about through the books, but it is a fascinating history that overlaps with a lot of other things. Economic, social conceptions of race and empire, certainly, or at least cultural imperialism, if we're talking about the 20th century. So fascinating topic, and one that I appreciate you saying that, Bo. One that I do use to get students thinking about a part of the world they don't think has any impact on their own lives. But I think potatoes and cocaine and all these other things have helped shape the modern world in ways that I think make people interested to learn about Peru.
Well, Bo, you're right. That does take the cup, and it's a good segue here. Okay,
That's true.
We're talking cups.
That's true.
What's in your cup? Look at that. Look at that.
Yeah, he's good. He's good.
Something of a pro here.
Well, hey, Mark's our guest here, so I have to ask, and I'm curious now that we've talked about potatoes, which could end up in vodka, and coca leaves, which ends up in cocaine. There's a variety of things that could be in your cup, and I'm curious. So, Mark, what's in your cup?
Well, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to do two things. The first is a clear spirit that is kind of the national spirit of Peru. It's known as pisco, and it is, as I understand it, it is almost like wine that is distilled again. And so it's famous, and its most common use in Peru is in a pisco sour, which is simple syrup and egg whites and pisco and ice, and you blend it and you put a dash of bitters on top of it. And it's I wouldn't want any of my Peruvian friends to hear me say it, but it's almost like a Peruvian margarita, and it's a fantastic way to ease your way into the late afternoon. But I also, given the fact that it is home brew history, I wanted to mention one of my favorite brews. And this is, I don't know if you can read the label there, but this is Chicha Chernobyl.
Oh.
And chicha is another one of those long-standing products of the Andes. It's basically home-brewed corn beer. And in its earliest form of being made, I believe women would chew up corn to get the process of breaking down the starches going with their saliva. And then they would store that corn in ceramics underground for a period of time, and that fermentation would take place. Now, this was an important drink in indigenous societies prior to the arrival of Europeans, and it continues to be important in places like Bolivia and Peru. This particular brand is pasteurized. So if you drink it, you don't have to worry about some of the gastrointestinal consequences you might encounter with the real homebrew stuff. And I just love the fact that they called their production facility Chernobyl. And seemingly unironically, when I asked them, why exactly did you do this? This is a place in Cochabamba, Bolivia. They're like, we just like the name. And I said, I like the name too.
How can one follow up with pre-chewed corn beer.
It's not. I mean, I will also say this. That might not sound very appetizing. It's not bad at all. And there's great places in areas like Cusco or La Paz or Cochabamba where you can consume this and have a wonderful meal and absolutely enjoy yourself.
Wow. Well,
the pre-chewed corn thing.
Yeah.
They don't make it that way anymore. I mean, most
okay.
True. Thank goodness. But I too have somewhat of a local brew. It's a little bit of Rawhide's Ponchatoula made strawberry whiskey. So it's hard to beat. Hard to beat.
Be a big letdown.
Yeah.
Big letdown.
All right.
All right. So I had an abundance of lemons and limes, and I decided to make limeade. That's it. That's all I got. It's just limeade. I have nothing to put in it. I got, hey. At least I made it.
I'm not as disappointed because I thought it was water, so I'm glad it's not that.
Oh no. No. I don't know how to hydrate. Come on.
Well, and again, I'm gonna throw you a lifeline here because limes are like at the center of Peruvian cuisine. So if you're making ceviche, you've got to have limes. And if you're a kid in Peru, you're drinking limonada made out of limes like all the time. So lemonade you were more on point than you knew there.
Bo, you know my affinity for a good lemon.
Yeah.
Right? I just eat those things.
Like it's an apple.
Yes, they're good. They're good. But since my teeth have gotten so bad, I have to be really careful about the acidity that I take in. And my mom brought me this lemon. She's like, "You're gonna love it. It's so juicy." And I touched it. I was like, "Oh, this is gonna be a great base for a limeade." I can tell. This is good. This is a good lemon. I was right. So, we've done that part. Bo, do we skipped one, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Sure did. So, Mark, when it comes to Peru, what is some of the biggest Peruvian buhiki? And what I mean by that is something in Peru.
Oh, I'm sorry. That sounds so terrible.
What?
What's the biggest piece of Peruvian buhiki? Like there's a lot of questions for what that is.
What's something that is just completely false? Something that people will regurgitate even though it's just completely wrong.
Ooh. Wow. All right. So I'm going to give you a couple. So the classic thing when I start with my study abroad or when I'm teaching, colonial Latin America or other things is, you get to that point of contact between Europeans and the Inca Empire, right? The Inca Empire, which was 14,000 miles from north to south, the largest indigenous empire in the New World at the time of contact, over, several million inhabitants. How did the Spaniards overthrow this, couple hundred group of Spaniards? How do they overthrow this empire? And it, speaking to historians, it might seem obvious. Well, it probably wasn't just the Spaniards, and probably a lot of things had to work out for them. But you'd be amazed at how hard it is to talk about this part of history or have a casual conversation with someone who's not, ready to dive in, and avoid that idea that it was a small number of Spaniards who were able to overthrow this incredibly huge empire. So I would say the first thing I would say is that it was Spaniards and tens of thousands of other native people who saw their opportunity to back the Spaniards and get rid of the Inca Empire. You had as much of a conflict between Andean people that facilitated the breakup of the Inca Empire and the arrival of the Spaniards as you did a conflict between Europeans and indigenous. That's the first thing I'd say. And I can elaborate on that, but I want to do another one. The second one I would say is the idea of Hiram Bingham discovering Machu Picchu. There's a fantastic book about this that I make the students that I take to Peru read. It's called Cradle of Gold. And it talks about how Hiram Bingham arrived in Machu Picchu and how that process worked and how he stole all the things that he stole and brought to Yale. Yale has since repatriated them, but that took a lot longer than you would expect. And it's more a tale of Hiram Bingham breaking every law he could than it is a story of him, doing the kind of diligent historical or archaeological or anthropological work that it would take to discover a lost city. There were people living there farming potatoes and coca leaves where Machu Picchu is today. So it wasn't lost. It was just, not on the Western academic radar when Hiram Bingham showed up. So reframing that story as a story of kind of a swashbuckling opportunist is one of the things I like to do, rather than it being the story of this intrepid Westerner who is able to, locate this great lost civilization, which is oftentimes, kind of what we go into it thinking. I certainly did when I was a lot younger, so I don't blame people for that impression.
There we go. Good boohickey.
Two of them.
Double boohickey.
Yeah.
Well, Bo, this is always a delight, always fun. I feel like I'm walking away from this one knowing a little bit more. Probably going to go and buy Cradle of Gold by Christopher Heaney because I need something else to read in addition to the stack of books that's right over there.
And while you're at it, you should. I think Amazon actually has this. Peru, at least at one point in time before Coca-Cola bought them out, had their own nationalistic soda, Inca Cola, and I was hoping that Mark has. Yeah, there it is. There it is.
I think that's blurred, unfortunately.
Blurred the label out. Oh, it won't let us do marketing. This is insane.
Well, Inca Cola is still around, and it's delicious. If you can get your hands on some, go for it. I got a 3-liter bottle in a store in Alexandria, Virginia, so you'll find it in interesting spots, and I think you can get it on Amazon. So it's delicious, even though it's now owned by the Coca-Cola Corporation. It's a Peruvian staple.
Well, Bo, Mark, one more time for Civil War Trails since it's here. But again, thanks to everyone for listening, for watching along, and we'll see you next time on the old homebrew. And as soon as I remember how to get us out of it's been a minute, okay?
This first time in Louisiana, the humidity, there was snow on the ground like a week ago.
We also haven't recorded an episode since like December 15th. So it's now February. Yeah. All right.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming on, Mark.
Here we go.